All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you to America is All In for giving us the opportunity to speak today. I'm Sarah States. I'm the Director of Research and Science Education at Phipps Conservatory and Botanical Gardens in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Today, we'll be talking about the myriad ways in which we engage with our stakeholders, with our communities about climate change. There's been a great deal of discussion about education, communication, and engagement, particularly with youth at COP. But if we don't have buy-in from all sectors of the American public, we're just not going to be able to meet our climate goals. I will share my screen. There we go. So today I am joined by some fantastic educators and researchers who will share some examples and best practices of how we've worked with our communities, as well as some of the science behind engagement and communication of climate issues. We'll also provide an overview of Action for Climate Empowerment, or ACE, to show why this framework is critical for a robust response to climate change. We'll have short presentations from each of the speakers here, and then we'll have some time at the end for a few questions. I have some prepared questions, or we can take questions from our audience. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Danielle Eisman, a visiting lecturer in the Department of Communication at Cornell University. Danielle?
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone who's joining the call. So I am going to speak first about the aspect of communication and behavior change, especially when thinking about how we drive individual behavior change, but also community change, because that's equally as important. Next slide, please. And so one of the images, I always love to show this image, and it really highlights some of those complications associated with individual behavior, because although governments for a very long time have been emphasizing the need to change individual behavior, the individual consumer is really kind of trapped within the system where they're very limited in their choices. So even though they can try and choose an environmentally friendly option in their daily choices, they're still kind of stuck within the system that needs cooperation across institutions, organizations, governments, as well as policy. So this is one of those examples that really pinpoints that intersection or that complexity associated with trying to change behavior, but also somewhat stuck within this kind of constant cycle of taking things from the ground, using it up, and then throwing it away. Next slide, please. And so, as much as we talk about behavior change, it's always very important to recognize that changing behavior is very, very difficult. And it's always a challenge to change behavior, especially when we're trying to convince people to engage in behaviors that are more environmentally friendly. So that it's not always about information or education, although that's a very important part. We also need to understand that human behaviors and decisions are not made within a vacuum. So the context, the social influences, our internal motivations, goals, emotional states, all kind of impede our decisions to choose one option, a more environmentally friendly option, such as cycling to work as opposed to driving, or taking a boat across the ocean to travel to Europe as opposed to flying. But again, our choices are made within this dominant economic system that's really driving large-scale environmental degradation. And so when we think about behavior change as well as communication about climate change, we also have to encourage those institutions, systems, and policies to change with us, so that individuals are changing along with the system that they are embedded in. Next slide, please. And so when we think about how behavior change has been approached for several decades, these are the dominant approaches. And so some of you might be familiar with the way that communication about climate change has been delivered to most of the public. So some of the more popular approaches are using normative messaging. So showing people that other people around them are doing the same behaviors. So you might see messages about how 95% of people in Glasgow, let's say, recycle every day. So that's an example of a normative message. We also rely a lot on values-based models. So trying to appeal to people's deeper values that tend to stay with them for a very long time. And so we think of values as something that is enduring in terms of a characteristic about a person. So organizations that are trying to motivate people to be more environmentally friendly may appeal to their deeper values, such as caring for the earth, being a good parent, thinking about future security. And so those are messages that can really connect with a person on a deeper, longer lasting level. And the other approach that's really been dominant within the field of behavior change and communication about climate change is the theory of planned behavior. And that's looking at people's attitudes, beliefs, norms, and then their perceived behavioral control. So is a person, do they feel as though they're capable of engaging in a new type of behavior? And what the model suggests is that if a person has a positive attitude towards a behavior, if it fits within the existing social norms and the person feels as though they're capable of carrying out that behavior, then they're more likely to engage in that behavior. But what we have seen is that intentions don't always lead to behavior. So a person might say, yeah, I care about the environment, and yeah, I think this is important. But then when they're making that decision of taking a weekend holiday, they're going to hop on a flight and still travel to another state or another country. Next slide, please. And so one of the revelations, and I think this has been emphasized a lot during this COP especially, is that when we think about the approaches that we are taking for encouraging system-wide change to ensure that we stay below 1.5 degrees C, people are starting to recognize that tacit knowledge or local knowledge is just as valuable as scientific knowledge. And so when we think about how we can encourage people to make changes, especially at the community level, then we need to involve people in these decisions. Next slide, please. And so one way that really helps, and something that we've started to see become more popular in climate change communication, especially when it comes to encouraging behavior change, is really looking at stories. And the reason why stories are so great, especially when trying to bridge that gap between community members and policymakers, is that these stories start to build connections. And if you've been sitting in a room where people are sharing stories about a particular topic, all of a sudden you see their eyes light up, and all of a sudden they have a story of a similar thing that has happened to them. And so, it starts to humanize this aspect. And so stories are a really great way to build a foundation between policymakers and communities when you're trying to activate significant change, especially in a world where you're trying to imagine a different future and a different way of living, and one that helps us achieve that 1.5 degree goal. Next slide, please. And so when we think about how you can do this, one of the simplified approach that we've developed is thinking about these three components. So if you're building a story, what is the conflict? Where is that challenge? What is that thing that you're trying to overcome? And what is the aha moment? What surprised you? What changed? What took you by surprise? And then what is the resolution? What did you learn? And getting people to walk in each other's shoes through these types of stories can really build that connection and mutual respect between parties that are often, on the opposite sides or on the opposite perspective. Next slide, please. And so, I don't want to go through all of these, but these are some examples and, some quotes from people that have experienced these storytelling workshops when you're trying to build connections and trying to learn from each other and really bridge that gap between policymakers and community members. And so it's a way of transforming people that are in this room together, trying to reach a common goal, but have different perspectives on it. And so I apply this to the transformative learning experiences that were developed by Keeley. And so you can see that in these quotes on the right-hand side, that people are really learning that we have more in common with each other than not. And that's a really great place to start when trying to encourage people to be more environmentally friendly and change their behavior and build action against climate change. Next slide. And again, these are more of that framework and more of that process. So sorry, I'm trying to quickly wrap up my section. So next slide, please. And this gives us another example. So kind of beyond that storytelling approach, we've been starting to think about how we can use social practices along with that notion of self-efficacy and sense of community to really drive more of that community level change as opposed to individual change. So as we think about how to encourage larger scale change, moving beyond just the individual, we can think about how people interact with the existing system and what is that infrastructure that needs to be changed in order to ensure that people are not wasting their food or recycling properly. Is it more about their daily life, or is it perceptions about who they are? Is it an aspect of culture? And so looking at it from this starburst of social practices, you can think about different levers that might affect one change on one side of the wheel and then interact with behavior on the other side of the wheel. Next slide, please. And so as we think about how to develop stronger approaches to behavior change, not just through communication, but through our interactions with each other, we can think about these wider practices and the challenges that people encounter in their daily lives, as well as some of the meanings associated with the things that we do on a daily basis, and then build that into our sense of community. And so using that storytelling technique to really build strong relationships with people within a community so that they have this greater aspect of self-efficacy. They feel empowered to make change and they feel as though they are capable of making change. And that's where that aspect of self-efficacy comes in. And next slide. And so as we promote more collective action, we can think about, or as I leave you with a couple of things to ponder as we move forward, it's important to recognize that individual knowledge and behavior change is just not enough to address these goals, but it is still very, very important, as Jen will discuss. And thinking about collective action can really enhance and promote greater levels of change, as well as build in stronger policy support across all groups. And as these behaviors become more normalized, collective efficacy will increase and we'll see greater levels of pro-environmental behaviors at that individual and community level. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Now I'll turn it over to Jen Kretzer, Director of Climate Initiatives at the Wild Center and also a U.S. ACE Coalition coordinating team member. Jen, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And thanks, Danielle. That was an awesome sort of on-ramp to some examples that I'm going to provide from, I work for a science institution called the Wild Center, and I want to talk a little bit about sort of the role that cultural institutions can play in communicating about not just climate change science, but also civics and action, and provide very clear path entry points for people to learn about climate change and learn about solutions and the challenges at hand. And then also share a few examples of how we're doing that at our institution in the Adirondack Park in Northern New York State. So next slide, please, Sarah. So we are a science center. We are located in the northern part of the Adirondacks, and I'd like to just acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Haudenosaunee people, both historical, traditional, and contemporary lands. We are a 115-acre science center that works to connect people and nature. And our job, I think, is to communicate not just science, but civics and action through a variety of lenses to help people connect in new ways and see and learn not just more about the place where they live or the place where they're visiting, but also sort of connecting the dots and helping learn how they can work towards stewardship and protection. So that's one of the many things that we do, and we try to provide a variety of entry points through our exhibitions, through our programming. We are both a science center, a nature center, an aquarium, and really a place to learn. So that's where I'm going to start. I do want to mention that science centers and museums in general have a high degree of public trust. And this is something that can really make a big difference in communicating around climate change effectively, and then also thinking about and knowing your audience. We have a lot of resources as a field. Just our institutions are the places where we inhabit, the staff that we have, the resources that we can provide to allow a platform for communicating about climate change, as well as how we can connect through community outreach and elevating voices that have not been heard. So specifically, I'm thinking about youth and also Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are, of course, as we all know, disproportionately being impacted by climate change. And museums can provide a really amazing opportunity to both anchor and provide a catalyst towards climate resilience, while also at the same time providing a platform for communication. Next slide. So I am also, as Sarah indicated, on the core team of the Action for Climate Empowerment. I just want to spend 1 minute talking about this, because this is a frame that we've really adopted at our Science Center to be thinking about the ways in which we talk and think about climate change and how we communicate about it. So ACE is actually part of the UN Convention, is Article 6 as well as Article 12 in the Paris Agreement. And it is a lens that allows us to think about education from a whole of society. So not just in the K-12 space, but across the education sector, and including training, public awareness, the public access for information, public participation and coordination of networks. It really aligns with that work towards providing a pathway towards a just climate transition and accelerating that pathway, as well as connecting across this. Cultural institutions do almost all of these things, or all of these things in different ways. And I think that they are great opportunities, again, to sort of anchor ACE. And if we can think about this framing as a way to approach our communication, we'll be able to connect with more people to accelerate the just transition. Next slide, please. So specifically, some ways in which museums do this are through our exhibitions. So our exhibitions allow people to walk through our site, read through signage, interact with an interpreter, to learn about science solutions. Next slide, please. We also do, of course, a lot of programming as a whole. Science institutions, I think there's somewhere in the neighborhood of over 30,000 informal cultural institutions in the United States. And if I think about that number, the way in which that could be amplified across our network through our programming and through our exhibitions to talk about climate change. But one of the ways that I think museums do an amazing job of this is by making things that feel very abstract, like data, visible, such as this with NOAA's Science on a Sphere at the Wild Center, where you look at very complex data in an extremely engaging and visual way. And it allows you to anchor this in story. So Danielle talked quite a bit about the role of story, and that's actually central and really critical to allow people to find a connection and to find common ground around talking about climate change, science, and solutions. Next slide. Another way in which, aside from being a demonstration and education site, is that we also work as a convener. So we have a couple of examples of this. One is a program that we've done called Wintergreen, which brought together, we went out into the community. This actually was held at a ski lodge. And being from Northern New York, tourism is an incredibly critical part of our economy. It makes up a huge portion of our economy. And we brought together business leaders and professionals to, again, start with the stories of what is important to them, and also to share those stories out and think about solutions together and collectively. We used our convening power as an institution to drive change and to drive conversations without an expected outcome. It's really about bringing those people together to allow for that conversation. Next slide, please. Another example of this would be after Hurricane Irene, we brought together, again, decision makers, the Department of Transportation, planners to think, and emergency personnel to think about how they can prepare for the next big emergency. But this again was around and rooted in sharing story. It's just a slightly different audience. So we really, again, can think about who we're talking to and what's important to them, and find those intersections and the intersectionality of these stories and shine a light on those places. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Another thing that we did, again, bringing together full museum takeover on the building trade. So we literally handed our museum over for building a Greener Adirondacks event, which was led by builders and architects and town planners to, again, have conversations around what works from a sustainable building design in the environment where we live. So that brought in a completely different audience into the institution. Next slide. And finally, another example is that we are working on a solutions exhibition that will open in 2022 to really elevate and highlight pathways to solutions. So again, using our power of it as a cultural institution to draw people in to talk about this. Next slide. And then quickly, I just want to mention our youth climate program. So this program works to convene young people around climate change through youth climate summits. Next slide. We bring together young people to learn about the climate science, impacts, and solutions. Again, a full museum takeover. So one of the things with this, and go to the next slide, please, Sarah, is how we're sharing or giving up authority. So this is another, from a communication standpoint, like we think about who has the power and who's communicating to each other. So most of the work with our youth climate summits is done in partnership with young people at the helm. And we provide sort of that support and framework, and we operate from these values, which help to sort of drive the program. They drive the program and provide this sort of foundation, but they also serve to form an opportunity for young people to develop the agency and efficacy they need to talk about climate change, to share about it with their peers. So they really, it's like the spheres of influence, they are really pushing on their spheres of influence through the frame in which we operate. So these values really form the core of that work. Next slide, Sarah. You can go to the next slide. At the core of that is our climate action planning. So again, where young people are driving, they're creating plans for themselves and their communities and driving action. Next slide. One last example I want to mention with this is that young people have this power of communicating with decision makers. So again, it's thinking of coming from this place of them telling their climate story, them working and intersecting with at an intergenerational level with business leaders and decision makers, and that young people have, and we've seen this over and over again at COP, have the power to influence decision makers in a way that's very different from what I might have. So, they're able to express their concerns and express their demands in a way that is really different. And so thinking about who's delivering the message, who's the message to, and how that's being communicated. Next slide. And we have a large network of over 100 summits in six countries. Next slide. And lots of free information. Next slide. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Jen. All right, so I'm going to talk a bit about another cultural institution where I am based. So Phipps Conservatory and Botanical Gardens is a botanical garden in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in Western Pennsylvania. It opened in 1893 during the height of the steel industry. And it was originally intended to be a source of respite from the extremely poor air quality of Pittsburgh at that time. And we still stand by that today. We want people to come to a botanical garden and connect with nature, appreciate the beauty of plants. But we've also realized that we use a lot of resources to grow tropical plants in a temperate climate. And so botanical gardens advocate for the environment, for biodiversity all the time. But we realized that we needed to walk the talk and that we needed to address climate change across all levels of our institution, from operations to horticulture to education. And so, as Jen said, museums and cultural institutions are a really big source of climate change information. People trust museums, but there was a study in 2010 that Americans were polled and only about 21% of them learned a lot or some information about climate change. So this means there's a huge opportunity to share with our visitors and our members about climate change. But engaging with our members can be really difficult. As you heard Danielle say, we often come up against a lot of challenges when we talk about climate change. There's cultural, political, religious conflicts. So I'm going to share about some of the actions that our visitors can take that we offer at Phipps, and some of the principles we use to communicate about climate change to our visitors through our science communication workshops where we help connect scientists to the public. All right. So one of the actions that we've taken is we've partnered with Green Mountain Energy, which is a renewable energy provider. And that allows people to switch their household energy to renewable energy. So when visitors come to Phipps, and switch their household to renewable energy on site, they can receive a free 1-year membership or a 6-month extension of their membership if they are already members. And so this is an individual action that people can take. And, Danielle talked about how individual actions aren't the only thing, but they are important. People are coming to us and asking us, what can we do? And so with this incentive, since 2017, we've had almost 6,000 people switch their household energy to renewables. And people were asking us, what else can I do? How can I shift other parts of my lifestyle or choices to make them more climate friendly? And we provide a number of individual actions and community actions that people can take. It's based on the work of Project Drawdown. We offer these on our website. And because we've made a lot of changes across our institution, for example, all of our energy at Phipps is powered by renewables, either by energy generated on site or through purchasing renewable energy credits. We've offered resources like a green events guide, so people can have a beautiful wedding and still reduce their impact on the climate. We also have a sustainable land care program where local landscapers can train with us to reduce their climate impacts. And we have a number of other resources available to anyone who comes to our website to reduce their impacts on the climate. And one of the other aspects in which we engage with the public is we really want to be a resource for scientists to be able to connect with the public and share their research with the public. Some folks do, some of these researchers are climate change researchers, but this is open to any scientist because these principles that Danielle mentioned and that Christina will talk about later are just key elements of science engagement. So we offer training to local scientists, and actually during the pandemic, we had scientists from all over the world taking our science communication workshops. We give these researchers a platform to engage with the public at Phipps. Pre-COVID, people would create tabling displays and talk to the public about their research. And we did some of this virtually during the pandemic as well. We have a BioBlitz where we have local scientists talk about the importance of biodiversity and caring for the environment. And we also have a specific training program for plant science PhD students where they receive research funding and training and opportunities to connect with the public. And we are very specific about this research, about this fellowship, because we really value when scientists are able to share their research with the public. But ultimately, science communication is an exercise in humanness. It's an exercise in connecting with the public and engaging with people on a personal level. So we emphasize in all of our communications, whether it's signage, whether it's our science communication training for researchers, that how someone feels after a conversation is just as important as the information that was shared during that conversation. So I'm going to share with you a few of the principles that we use in our communication about how you connect and know your audience. So if you want to engage your audience, you need to know who they are. And we encourage other institutions to consider membership surveys. You can use local demographic information to know more about the people that you're engaging with. What does your audience find interesting? Are there local sources of pride, history, cultural relevance that connect to climate-related issues? Pittsburghers have tons of pride in their hometown, and I'm sure other folks around the country recognize that in their own communities. In Pittsburgh, this was the birth of the steel industry. There's a huge history of fossil fuels in this area. And so we have to be cognizant of that when we're talking to people. We have to realize that there's a lot of pride and family history involved, wrapped up in the fossil fuel industry. And we have to respect that. We have to go in with a respectful way, engaging these people. And so when we're talking about our signage or using our messaging to connect with the public, we usually default to a 5th to 7th grade level of material because, for some folks, it's been a long time since they've engaged with science, since they've had a science class. And we tell people, if that seems too simple, remember that you could always have a longer conversation with these people. It's really that entry point that you want to be simplified and allow people to have a connection to it. We also engage in what we call a stakeholder analysis. What is the context of climate change or another science topic in your region? So what are all of the possible stakeholders involved in the issue? And this kind of connects with what Jen was talking about with wintergreen. Who is involved in this issue? What is their motivation? Where is it coming from? Is it financial? Is it religious, cultural, health? There's many other ways in which people can have a motivation with an issue. And for example, I'm from Western New York originally. Fracking is a huge topic. A lot of rural communities have few job opportunities. So they see this as a way to make money and support their families. So this is a little table that we have our scientists think about all the stakeholders who are connecting with their issue. What is the motivation and what do you need to know as a communicator to talk about these how do you talk about these issues with these different groups? And we always say, and we heard this a lot at COP, more data, 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 data. If people just understand the data, they'll come around and believe what you're telling them about climate change. But addressing skepticism and hostility to science doesn't help when you just throw more data on them, because really it looks like this. People aren't going to respond well to more data. You need to create a story. You need to find a way to connect with them. So if we're talking about climate change in Western Pennsylvania, I could tell you that here's the data. The weather is warmer and wetter over the past century, but people have probably heard this before. But when you talk to them about some of the infrastructure issues that we've had more landslides, there's more intense freeze-thaw cycles, and we have, in 2018, we had a ton of landslides, and people see that in their communities. They can connect to this. They might drive on this road every day. So this is a way in which you can start to have this conversation about climate change. And then ultimately, it's local stories, cautionary and empowering, that are the best to connect to listeners. So we have this region of highway in Pittsburgh called the Bathtub, and you can see why, because it floods when there's really intense rainstorms. But really, we need to give people opportunities for action. We need to inspire them with hope. And there are so many hopeful stories out there. There's so many at COP. And I know that we can find ways to connect with our communities in a positive way about climate change. So that was just another introduction, another overview of how cultural institutions are working with their communities. And I am excited to turn it over now to, thank you for your time, to Kristin Poppleton. She is the Senior Director of Programs for Climate Generation, a Will Stager legacy, and she is also a U.S. ACE Coalition coordinating team member. Kristin?
Hey, everyone. Can you give me a thumbs up, Sarah, that you can hear me?
We can hear you.
Awesome. I am coming to you live from the New York Times Climate Hub in Glasgow, Scotland. So hopefully my internet holds out for y'all. I'm so excited to follow up after all this great examples and theory and research, because I just feel like it's given me this beautiful setup to talk about some really practical examples of how you can use storytelling to accelerate action on climate change. You can go for a slide, Sarah. My organization is Climate Generation. Our mission is to empower individuals and their communities to engage in solutions to climate change. And we work with youth, we work with educators, we work with communities, and we work with influentials. Slide. And our overarching goal is to ignite and sustain the ability of these stakeholders I mentioned to act on the systems perpetuating the climate crisis. And you can go ahead to the next slide. We lean into these three basic pillars to do that. All of them really weaving them through our communications and our programming, and when we think about the work that we do. And those are overcoming disinformation, centering anti-racism and economic equity, and personalizing and localizing climate change action. All things I think that we have heard so far as we've been hearing from our other speakers. You can do a slide. And so our role in the community throughout the country and sometimes internationally is to convene, to engage, and sustain. We convene individuals in local settings and regional settings to learn about climate change, to talk about climate change. We engage through our network of Teach Climate network of educators. We engage through developing climate narratives and with the youth activists that we work with. And then we really look to sustain that engagement through our programs, through the networks that we're developing, and providing some meaningful, and I would say really authentic partnerships and support. Slide. So another way of thinking about, we've heard about ACE a few times here, Action for Climate Empowerment. We really love that exists in the world as an organization, because quite honestly, it is the work that we do. Education and engagement is what we see as the most critical thing for accelerating action on climate change. And we also know that it's actually been recognized as one of the 6 key social tipping points to actually realize the goals of the Paris Agreement, to realize the goals that are ahead. Slide. And we've also heard a little bit about the research out there on communication and speaking. One of the things that we really lean into organizationally is the fact that while over 70% of Americans believe climate change is actually happening, 35% actually or less are actually talking about it. And so that is an opportunity that as a nonprofit that works in education engagement, that we need to seize, and we need to develop tools to take action on. You can move ahead. I think we've also heard a little bit about this, about the need to really connect that head, that cerebral piece, with the heart. And we know that stories are an excellent way of doing that. As an organization, we use story in a multitude of different ways. And I'm going to share a couple of examples with y'all here today. Slide. And I'll start just from the beginning. Our organization was founded in 2006 by a polar explorer, National Geographic explorer Will Steger. And Will, in his 50 years of travel, has been eyewitness to the impacts of climate change in the polar regions. And when we were founded, we really based our program and our work on his personal story. At that point in time, we weren't really talking about how everyone was an eyewitness to climate change. It was the polar regions that were our canary in a coal mine. And it was Will's story that really galvanized thousands of folks, especially throughout the Midwest, but he's fairly well known in the polar regions internationally, to take some action. And so his story is really woven in the DNA of our organization. You can go to the next slide. This is a film clip, and you don't need to play it. We'll see if we can play a section of it. But when I was at the last COP, the last conference of the parties in Paris, I had the opportunity to attend a panel that featured storytellers from Pacific Islands. And one of them was Kathy Jetnil-Kidgener, which you may know of her poem. If you haven't heard it before, it was used. She's from the Marshall Islands. And watching this panel of storytellers was the first time I'd really seen that being used as a really compelling way to grip people on this issue and move them to action. And it really inspired a lot of the programming that I'm going to talk about now. And I think it's cool, full circle, that I'm here sitting at the next COP that I attended, thinking back on that first time. And cognizant of time, I won't play that clip, but I encourage you to look her up. Go ahead to the next. And so the first thing that came out of that was a series of 12 convenings that we held throughout the state of Minnesota, that then became youth convenings. And those convenings were a little bit different than the program that people had been doing, because we were bringing in well-known climatologists, weather speakers in our state to talk about very local impacts of climate change. But then we were featuring a panel of 3 storytellers. And those were just people from the community that were telling a story of how they were experiencing climate change and also the action they were taking. And then also then featuring solutions workshops. And so this model of engaging the community through story was where we really started thinking, let's not just put that sage on the stage up there. Let's bring in local folks that are just going to actually make this real for everyone. Knowing also, as Jen mentioned, the power of youth voice, and seeing that in a few of our convenings, we actually had youth planning more of it. We took that model and actually had youth planning convenings for a few years as well throughout the state, doing the same sort of model. Move ahead, slide. We also then were thinking about, so Minnesota has all these great stories that we've been developing through this. And we worked with our local public television station to develop a documentary That was Minnesota Stories on Climate Change. Once again, very differently, they interviewed an artist, they interviewed a grocer, they interviewed different people who don't necessarily always get seen as like the experts on climate change on their experience, while weaving in that science. So bringing that science and those impacts and solutions to life. So you can do a slide. So what is a climate story? Well, I'm not going to pretend that we've invented the model of how you write a climate story, but we have developed one that we use. And basically, we see it as this personal story about your experience of climate change, something that's descriptive, something that's personal, something that makes an emotional connection. And we ask folks to go through, you can do a slide, a series of prompts to develop their story. We do workshops on this. And so we start with just having
Kristin, are you there? Oh, I think we may have lost her.
your experience of climate change. Next slide. Oh, am I frozen?
I think we can hear you again. You're good. Ooh,
Oh, am I back?
I think you're back.
Okay, am I back? What slide are we on?
What is your experience of climate change?
Great. There we are. And so what is your experience of climate change? Thinking about that. And then moving on, tell a story about climate change, and how you felt your voice was powerful. So getting into this hopeful piece. And then finally, transitioning, imagining what you think a better world could be, and what it would look like to you. Then the next slide, looking at how you weave those pieces together. And so this was sort of a building out, and I'm telling you kind of the story of progression of story with us. And you can move to the next slide. And from this, we started asking for submissions to our storytelling collection, which you can check out. And also realizing that just developing a story is great, but what are we going to do with it was important. So how could folks share it? How could they use it as in a letter to a legislature? How could we connect them with to write an op-ed with a local media outlet? And so that kind of branched out to the next slide. A series of programs that we've been running now yearly called our Talk Climate Institute. This institute is based in a local place that we really try to bring the flavor of that place out of, where we bring in for 2 days speakers on behavior change and how we talk, and doing this climate storytelling workshop, and then workshops on how to take your story and move it to and so this particular institute was held in Duluth, Minnesota, which has a very strong Anishinaabe population. And we really focused on traditional ecological knowledge. You could go to the next slide. Whereas the one we just had recently this last year virtually was really a national focus. And we were really moving into climate justice and social justice being a focus that we needed to think about the intersection of, and highlighting these Black, Indigenous, and people of color's voices in the movement, moving ahead. And so these institutes, you can actually slide up to the slide 70, just the bar graph, but there have profound for people to really feel what we just heard, this collective efficacy, self-efficacy, feeling like people can move to action, and really powerful opportunities for folks. You can go to the next slide. We've also used storytelling through working with a parks district, where we use stories to bring to local convenings in those. And you can slide ahead to the next slide. Using it out in the media, propping up the storytellers, connecting them with that. You can go to the next slide. And holding, and we don't need to play this either, but we had an actual concert where we coached very well-known local musicians to tell their climate story during a concert and then sing. And so once again, bringing the arts in. And I'll just close with sharing a little bit about going to the next slide, and you can go to the next slide. Our last we've really worked on is this book of literary activism, which we developed, and then by a call for action for people to submit stories, and then actually produced and distributed to all of the policymakers in Minnesota, and held a press conference that was bipartisan, and basing it really on this is what Minnesotans want, this is what Minnesota needs. And if you want to scroll ahead just to slide 78, so go through just a couple more, being conscious of time here. And right now, just to close it out, encourage you all to check out our COP26 delegation, because all 6 of our delegates that are been here in Glasgow with us developed their climate story to start this experience, to think about what their stake in it would be and how they would be communicating on it while they were here. And so once again, how we use story. And we can close it out if you want with the slide 81, conscious on Christina's time.
Thank you so much, Kristin. It's great to hear about all these ways you're connecting with the community. All right, last but not least, we have Christina Kwok. She is the research director at Unbounded Associates and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, talking a bit more about research and education. Christina, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to use a little bit of time to talk a little bit about how we've attempted to communicate to education decision makers, policymakers, education leaders, not only about the importance of investing in education, but also what quality education for climate action looks like, or what it should look like. Next slide, please. So to start, I think in our communication, we really try to focus on how we frame the climate crisis, and how we frame that climate crisis matters, especially when it comes to then how we define our education and training solutions. So on the one hand, we can consider that climate change is a technical challenge, due to human activity over the last century. The Earth's atmosphere now has way too much greenhouse gas emissions than it can naturally absorb, trapping heat and causing average temperatures to rise around the globe. This is, the story that we know, especially at COP26 in Glasgow. But with the problem focused on greenhouse gases, especially on carbon dioxide, the solutions that follow are really focused around decreasing the amount of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere by both removing existing emissions and mitigating against further emissions. And then from that framing of the climate crisis, the social adaptation that's needed is transitioning from high carbon economies to carbon neutral economies, what we might want to call a green economy. The implications for the education sector then is to really focus on building a workforce that has the specific capacities needed to support such a transition, right? So I think we're all very familiar with this particular framing. But the climate crisis is also a sociological problem. It's an adaptive challenge, which requires not just technical skills for wind turbine technicians, solar panel installers, but it's also, we're going to require new ways of being, thinking, and doing in the world. So we can frame this adaptive challenge as being rooted in unsustainable behaviors at the individual level, something that Danielle talked a little bit at the beginning, including one's own consumption patterns, energy usage, lifestyle choices, and so on. From this framing of an adaptive challenge, then the role of education is to shift the individual's generic capacities towards those that generate more sustainable behaviors. So this could involve improving the individual's awareness of climate change through stories, through data, knowledge of solutions, and so on. But we have to also consider that the adaptive challenge of the climate crisis isn't just a problem of unsustainable individual behavior, but it's also one of human systems, which I think all of our speakers before just mentioned. So to this effect, if we conceptualize the climate crisis as a symptom of unjust social and economic systems, including policies that perpetuate environmental racism, and those that incentivize extractive capitalism, including industries, especially those that disproportionately impact Black, Indigenous, and people of color, women and girls, low-income communities, low-income countries, then from that framing of the climate crisis, the role of education expands to really focusing on developing the transformative capacities of individuals and society to really catalyze broader systems change for both social and climate justice. All right, so all of these conceptualizations of the climate crisis are valid. They're all real. The climate crisis is a technical challenge. It is also an adaptive challenge. It's individual, it's systemic. And just as there's no single solution to climate change, there is no single educational solution for climate action. And this is something that we really try to communicate to decision makers to really begin to think critically and expansively about the different education solutions that need to follow suit. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, I think much of the discussions, especially the discussions in Glasgow these last 2 weeks, has really been dominated by a focus on closing the emissions gap. So this is the difference between the projected levels of greenhouse gas emissions under business as usual and the level of emissions reductions that are needed in order to achieve the 1.5 degree target. Next slide, please. But many of the discussions that I think are happening in Glasgow, I'm not there, unfortunately, so I'm not privy to the sidebar conversations that are happening, but I think most of the conversations that are happening are not really attending to the education gap. And so this is the difference between our levels of climate knowledge, green skills, climate consciousness under an education as usual scenario, and the level that these need to be in order to achieve our climate goals, whether that's mitigation, adaptation, just transitions, or systems transformation, sustainable development goals, you name it. So this gap exists despite our attention to Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, Article 6 of the UNFCCC, which really calls on governments to engage in the important work of education, training, public awareness, and so on, which Jen mentioned for us earlier. But we have to really consider that in many ways, closing the emissions gap is dependent on closing the education gap, something that Kristin mentioned in one of her slides. So we really have to consider how can we leverage our education systems for all of the different kinds of solutions that it can bring for us. Next slide, please. So we, in order to try to help provide decision makers with a framework for thinking about that breadth of educational opportunities, we scoured the literature to try to understand what are the kinds of skills, the kinds of capacities, the kinds of consciousnesses that are needed to really inspire climate action and achieve climate justice. Next slide, please. And so from our literature review, we found that green skills tended to coalesce around two particular but overlapping paradigms. So I'll go through this really quickly. On the left side, we've got those skills that fell under a green jobs paradigm that really highlighted some of the specific capacities that are needed to thrive in green jobs in a low carbon green economy. And these could range from environmental management skills to project management to those skills that are traditionally provided or taught in training and technical institutions in the past. On the right side are the skills that are required for green transformations, transformative capacities that are really needed to disrupt and transform individual and structural factors that exacerbate the climate crisis. Skills like integrative thinking, systems thinking, the ability to analyze and navigate unequal systems of power, and so on. But shared between these two distinct paradigms were a set of green skills in the middle column that we call green life skills. These are generic capacities like critical thinking, communications, problem solving, and so on that can contribute to greener ways of thinking, being, and doing that we oftentimes talk about in the context of sustainability education or climate education or so on. And so from here, if you want to go to the next slide, we also developed a sort of a heuristic or a framework for decision makers to really begin to think about and see holistically the range of educational solutions and the range of skills that are needed through our education and training approaches when it comes to achieving our climate targets and the achievement of climate justice. And so that's whether you have stakeholders that are considered or decision makers that are thinking about the technical challenges or thinking about the adaptive challenges, the green and the blue columns there. whether we're thinking about, the source of the problem as being, CO2 emissions, unsustainable individual behaviors, or unjust social and economic systems, and so on. So, you can follow this sort of framework for really thinking about, the different sources of the problem, the different visions of the solutions, and then therefore what the educational objective should really be about. But the critical piece, if you want to go to the next slide, is that we really have to pay attention to the breadth of green skills, that range of specific capacities, the generic capacities, and the transformative capacities that are really critical to really catalyze that broader, both the individual change, but most importantly, the systems change. So I think that's all of my slides that I have. Thanks for your attention. And I hope that sort of wraps up in a conceptual way to take home with you all today, some of what we've been talking about in terms of communicating climate change. Whoops.
Thank you so much, Christina. I think we are out of time. I think we do have time for a couple questions if you all have time, my fellow panelists. I do want to ask one question because we don't have a lot of time. What is one key point you'd like audience members here to remember about climate engagement in our communities? And perhaps we can go in the order that we spoke today. Just one key piece to climate communication. Danielle?
Well, I guess, especially after listening to everybody else's discussion, that, stories are a key part of engaging people with climate change and with climate science.
Thank you, Danielle. Jen?
I think listening. I think that's such an important skill that, listening to who your audience is, listening where they're coming from, and thinking about how you can find that common ground and find the empathy and compassion to build that understanding. I think that kind of heart-to-heart relationship piece is so critical in this to meet the moment that we need to meet.
Jen, I agree. And that kind of builds on what Kristin said with the brain to heart connection. Building on that, I want to remind us we can't be disdainful of people that we disagree with or that work in the fossil fuel industries, particularly those people who have the really hard, dirty jobs that are just trying to take care of their families. We have to have a personal connection and remember that everyone has to have their basic needs met. So really a respect for all of our audiences, whether we agree with them or not. Kristin, did you have
Yeah. Well, I didn't talk much about it, but this week our delegation is all from Indigenous communities in the upper Midwest, the Dakota and the Anishinaabe people. And it's something that academically I think we all know and we hear said, and up on the big lofty stages that we should be listening to Indigenous peoples and centering them in our decision making, but we're not. And so that would be what I would say. It's not about what we so-called experts have to say. It's what the people in our community and the knowledge that they can share with us is actually what's most important.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kristin. And Christina?
Yeah, I think my point about communication would really be that we have multiple frames that we can rely on. And if we feel that our audience is not in sort of the space of radical transformation, we have other aspects, other avenues that I think can really draw on the values and the way that they frame the problem. So I would encourage us all to really consider what are those different multiple frames that we can kind of fall back to in our storytelling and in our communication.
Thanks, Christina. All right, I'll just get one more question for all of you. So what are our next steps after COP for the ACE community? How can we best use our shared expertise with the limited resources that ACE provides? Danielle, do you want to give this one a shot?
I might need another minute to think about that.
Sure. Does anyone else want to jump in?
I'll jump in real quick. I think what just recognizing kind of where things have come at this year's COP, that we could really use our collective power and our collective networks to ensure that the bar doesn't get lowered in terms of what we're actually demanding when it comes to climate change education and climate justice. And I think what we have seen at COP is that leaders are willing to give us a little bit and make a space for the need for education to really attain its important status, but not to get us to the space of transformation. And I think we really need to just keep pushing for that more radical approach to education that we really need.
Excellent point, Christina. Jen or Kristin, do you have thoughts on this?
Oh gosh, not after Christina. I mean, I always I'll go at it from like a super practical level. I think that one of the things that I've witnessed this year being part of the ACE coordinating team is like the exponential growth of this network and the need for us to stay connected. And that is, I guess, the next step actually is to figure out how we are going to do that, to lean into each other's strengths. And just like this webinar itself, I didn't know Danielle before this, but like, I would love to do a presentation with Danielle again, where she does all that great theory and I get to talk about the fun ways that you can implement it. So just thinking about those things and staying connected through that.
I guess I would just add, I mean, everyone else has already really sort of said everything. I'll just say that I just don't think we can underestimate the power of like subnational work, like working at the local and state and regional level and across partnerships. I just feel there's so much power in civil society that we do have a voice. We do have a way. I feel like there is a path forward, a multiple paths forward, and I'm excited about it, and I feel very optimistic at the moment. So I'm excited to sort of take that next step with ACE and building our coalition and reaching out and building those relationships across the U.S. and around the globe, of course, too.
Thanks, Jen. And I have to admit, I'm new to COP. I'm relatively new to ACE as well. So it's been great to see all of the motivated, really experienced folks who are doing great climate work and climate engagement. So I think we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We need to continue to build this network. And to emphasize, I don't have the slide with me, but for folks out there who are new to ACE, you can send an email to usacecoalition.org to join, to learn more, to get connected with all of us here. I look forward to working more with these really talented women. I want to thank you all for joining me today. This program came together fairly quickly. So thanks for bringing all of your great work to this. Anything else that anyone would like to add? I think we have to go, but if anyone has any last comments, please jump in.
Thanks, Sarah, for bringing us together.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thanks again to the America is All In and to the U.S. Climate Action Center for hosting us. I look forward to seeing what great work we continue to do on climate action. So thanks everyone for being here today.
Thank you.